The moving truck rumbled past my apartment window at 7 in the morning, its diesel engine cutting through the California dawn like a knife through silence. I pressed my face against the glass, watching strangers load furniture that looked eerily familiar into the back of that massive vehicle. A wooden dining table that had hosted every birthday dinner of my childhood, a recliner where my father used to fall asleep watching baseball games. And then I saw it, the hand-carved jewelry box he'd made for me when I turned 16, sitting carelessly on top of a stack of boxes labeled fragile in red letters that might as well have been written in my own blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands started shaking because I knew that jewelry box. I knew every groove my father's careful fingers had carved into its surface. I knew the way it creaked when you opened the lid, and the tiny mirror inside that had reflected my face through 1,000 teenage mornings. But I didn't know why strangers were loading it into a truck outside 847 Maple Street, the house that was supposed to be half mine. My name is Jessica Martinez, and 8 months ago, my world shifted on its axis when my father passed away from a heart attack that took him too young and too suddenly. Dad was the kind of man who built things with his hands and fixed problems with patience rather than anger. He worked construction for 30 years, came home covered in dust and cement, but still had energy to help me with homework or teach my brother Mike how to throw a proper curveball in the backyard. The house on Maple Street wasn't just our family home, it was Dad's masterpiece, a 1960s ranch he'd spent decades improving with his own labor and love. When the lawyer read Dad's will in that sterile conference room that smelled like old leather and disappointment, everything seemed straightforward. The house would go to Mike and me, 50-50 split. We could sell it and divide the money, or one of us could buy out the other's share. Simple, clean, fair. Mike nodded seriously during the reading, his real estate agent training making him look professional and trustworthy in his crisp button-down shirt. He shook the lawyer's hand afterward and told me not to worry about any of the paperwork. He'd handle everything since he understood property transactions better than I did. I should have paid attention to the way his eyes avoided mine when he said it. For months Mike kept me updated with vague reassurances. The market was complicated. We needed to get the house appraised properly. There were some title issues to sort out first. Being fresh out of college and drowning in my entry-level marketing job, I was grateful someone else was managing the complexity. Mike had always been the responsible older brother, the one who helped Dad with the business side of his construction projects, the one who seemed to understand money and legal documents in ways that made my head spin. The morning I saw that moving truck, I'd been living in my cramped studio apartment for 3 months, stretching every paycheck and eating ramen more nights than I care to admit. I'd asked Mike several times about the timeline for selling the house, especially since my student loans were starting to demand payments I couldn't afford. Each time he'd pat my shoulder and promise we were getting close to listing it. Soon he'd say, very soon. I threw on jeans and a UCLA sweatshirt and drove the 15 minutes from my apartment to Maple Street with my heart hammering against my ribs. The house looked different somehow, more abandoned than empty. The front lawn needed cutting, and Dad's rose bushes were starting to look wild and untended. A bright orange sold sign was planted firmly in the front yard like a flag marking conquered territory. Mrs. Chen from next door was watering her petunias when she spotted me standing frozen on the sidewalk. She'd known our family since I was 8 years old, had brought us casseroles after Mom died when I was in high school, and had helped Dad install the fence between their properties. Her face lit up when she saw me, then immediately shifted to confusion. Jessica, honey, I was wondering when you'd come by to say goodbye to the house. Tom Bennett seems like a nice young man. He mentioned he's planning to renovate the kitchen and add a second bathroom. Your father would have loved knowing someone with construction experience bought his place. The words hit me like cold water. Someone named Tom Bennett had bought our house. Not someone who might buy it. Someone who had bought it. Past tense, completed transaction, done deal. Mrs. Chen, I managed to say through lips that felt suddenly numb. When exactly did the house sell? Her eyebrows drew together with concern. About 3 weeks ago, dear. The closing was quite quick. Your brother said you were both eager to move forward after your father's passing. Such a difficult time for your family. 3 weeks ago. While I'd been asking Mike about listing timelines and market conditions, strangers had already signed papers and handed over money and begun planning renovations to the house where I'd learned to ride a bike and celebrated every Christmas morning for 16 years. While I'd been trusting my brother to protect our shared inheritance, he'd been orchestrating its disappearance. I thanked Mrs. Chen with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else and walked back to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body. My phone was in my hands before I consciously decided to call Mike, muscle memory taking over when rational thought abandoned me completely. He answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. Jess, what's up, little sister? Mike, I'm standing outside the house. There's a sold sign in the yard, and Mrs. Chen just told me someone named Tom Bennett bought it 3 weeks ago. What the hell is going on? The background noise cut off abruptly, like he'd stepped outside or into another room. When he spoke again, his voice carried that carefully modulated tone he used when he was trying to manage a difficult client. Jess, listen, I was going to call you today. I know this looks confusing, but I had to move fast on an opportunity. Bennett offered us $20,000 over asking price, but he needed to close quickly for tax reasons. I tried calling you, but you know how busy you've been with work, and I didn't want us to lose the deal while we were playing phone tag. You tried calling me. Mike, I check my phone obsessively. I haven't missed a call from you in months. A pause. Too long. When someone is telling the truth, they don't need time to arrange their words. Your phone must have been going straight to voicemail. Look, the important thing is we got an amazing price. $425,000. After the realtor fees and closing costs, your half comes to about $200,000. I've got your check right here. $200,000 should have felt like winning the lottery to someone living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment. Instead, it felt like being offered payment for something that had been stolen from me. Because houses don't sell in 3 days without their owners knowing. Paperwork doesn't process without signatures. And brothers don't handle business deals in secret unless they have something to hide. Mike, I never signed anything. I never agreed to sell. I never even saw a listing or a sales contract. Of course you did. Remember when I brought those documents by your apartment about a month ago? You were rushing to get ready for work, and you signed them without really looking. I told you they were preliminary paperwork for the appraisal. Except he hadn't brought any documents by my apartment a month ago. Or 2 months ago, or ever. Mike lived in a luxury apartment complex downtown and hadn't set foot in my building since I'd moved in. The last time I'd signed anything related to the house was at the lawyer's office, the day we read Dad's will, and that was just an acknowledgement that I'd received my copy of the document. I'm coming over, I said. We need to talk about this in person. Actually, I'm out of town right now. Business conference in San Diego. But I'll be back next week, and we can sit down and go through all the paperwork. You'll see everything was handled properly. Through the phone, I could hear a sound I recognized, the distinctive chime of the elevator in his apartment building. The same sound I'd heard dozens of times when visiting him over the years. Mike wasn't in San Diego at any business conference. He was in his apartment, lying to me with the same casual ease most people use to comment on the weather. That evening, I sat in my car outside Golden State Realty, the agency where Mike worked, waiting for someone to turn off the lights and lock the front door. I'd driven there.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Without a real plan, operating on the kind of desperate instinct that takes over when your entire reality has been revealed as carefully constructed fiction. The building was modern glass and steel, the kind of place that projected success and trustworthiness to clients who were making the largest financial transactions of their lives. When the last employee finally left, I called Mike again. "I'm outside your office," I said when he answered. "I know you're not in San Diego." The silence stretched long enough for me to count my own heartbeats. "Jess, you're starting to worry me. This isn't like you. Why don't you take a few days to process everything, and then we can talk when you're feeling more rational?" Rational. He was using the word like a weapon, the way men do when they want to dismiss women's legitimate concerns by suggesting they're being emotional rather than logical. The same way he dismissed my questions about the house timeline for months. "I want to see the sales contract. I want to see my signature on the documents. I want proof that I agreed to sell Dad's house, of course, like I said, when I get back from San Diego." "You're not in San Diego, Mike. I can see your car in the parking lot of your apartment complex from where I'm sitting." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, you caught me. I'm not in San Diego. I told you that because I didn't want to deal with this conversation when you're clearly upset. But the sale is legitimate, Jess. Everything was handled by the book." "Then show me the book, tonight, now." He sighed like I was being unreasonable, like I was the problem in this situation. "Fine, come up to my apartment, but I want you to understand that questioning my integrity is really hurtful. Especially during such a difficult time for our family." Mike's apartment was everything mine wasn't: spacious, modern, expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and his furniture looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than real life. What caught my attention immediately was the absence of moving boxes, or any signs that he was preparing to relocate with his share of the house money. Instead, I noticed new additions since my last visit. A massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, a leather sectional that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Car keys on the counter next to what looked like the key fob for a BMW. "Nice place," I said, taking in the obvious signs of recent expensive purchases. "Business must be good." Mike followed my gaze to the TV and shifted uncomfortably. "I've had a few big sales recently. Real estate market's been strong." He led me to his dining table where a manila folder waited with my name written on the tab in his handwriting. Inside were copies of documents that made my stomach drop toward my feet. A sales contract with my signature clearly visible at the bottom. A power of attorney form that appeared to give Mike authority to act on my behalf in real estate transactions. A notarized affidavit stating that I was voluntarily transferring my ownership interest in the property to facilitate the sale. My signature was on every page, written in blue ink in handwriting that looked exactly like mine, except I'd never seen any of these documents before in my life. "This is impossible," I whispered, staring at what appeared to be my own name written in my own hand on papers I'd never touched. "I never signed these." Mike sat down across from me with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "You did sign them, Jess. I know you were distracted that day because of work stress, but you definitely signed them. Look, I even had them notarized to make sure everything was completely legal." The notary stamp at the bottom of each page was real, embossed and official-looking. The signature matched mine perfectly, not close enough to pass casual inspection, but absolutely identical in every curve and loop. If I hadn't known with absolute certainty that I'd never signed these documents, I would have believed the evidence of my own eyes. "Mike," I said slowly, "I need you to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Did you forge my signature on these documents?" His face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, hurt, indignation, each one perfectly calculated and completely unconvincing. "I can't believe you'd accuse me of something like that. I'm your brother, Jess. I would never commit fraud against my own family." "The stress of losing Dad has obviously been harder on you than I realized," but while his mouth was saying one thing, his body was saying something else entirely. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white with tension. He couldn't maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. And there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't asking me why I thought he would forge documents. He wasn't demanding to know what had given me such a terrible idea about his character. He was defending himself against an accusation, which meant part of him already knew he was guilty. If you legitimately handled this sale with my knowledge and consent, I said, then you won't mind if I have an attorney review these documents. Of course not. Though I have to say, hiring a lawyer seems like a waste of money when we could just work this out between ourselves like family should. I gathered the papers and stood up, noticing how Mike's expensive apartment suddenly felt less like a showcase and more like evidence. Evidence of money that had appeared suddenly, evidence of a lifestyle that didn't match his usual income level. Evidence of someone who'd recently come into a significant amount of cash. I'll be in touch, I said, heading for the door. Jess, wait, his voice stopped me at the threshold. I know you're upset about the house. I know it held a lot of sentimental value for you. But Dad wouldn't have wanted us fighting over money, he would have wanted us to stick together as family. I turned back to look at him, this man who shared my blood and my childhood, and apparently nothing else that mattered. You're right, I said. Dad would have wanted us to stick together. He also would have wanted both of his children to benefit equally from the inheritance he left us. If you really sold that house with my knowledge and consent, then where's my $200,000? Mike's face went pale, because in all his careful planning and document preparation and elaborate explanations, he'd forgotten the most basic element of any legitimate transaction, actually giving me my share of the money. The funds are still in escrow, while the paperwork finalizes. The house closed 3 weeks ago, Mike. There is no escrow period after closing. I left him standing in his expensive apartment, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, and drove home through streets that looked different somehow, like I was seeing my own city through someone else's eyes. The Jessica Martinez, who had walked into that apartment an hour ago, had been someone who trusted her family and believed in the fundamental goodness of people she loved. The Jessica Martinez driving home was someone who understood that trust could be weaponized, and love could be a vulnerability that others exploit. But she was also someone who was no longer going to be anyone's victim. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching attorneys who specialized in real estate fraud. I found Linda Chen through online reviews that praised her thoroughness and her track record of winning cases against larger, better-funded opponents. Her office was in a converted Victorian house in Riverside's historic district, and her assistant scheduled me for a consultation that same afternoon. Linda Chen was probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my story as I told it. She examined the documents Mike had shown me, then asked me to write my signature on a piece of paper several times. When I finished, she placed my authentic signatures next to the ones on the sales contract and power of attorney forms. These are very good forgeries, she said matter-of-factly, probably traced rather than freehand copied, but there are tells that indicate fraud. Look at the pressure variations here, and the way certain letters are formed. Most importantly though, these documents were all allegedly signed and notarized on the same day, but they show different ink colors and slightly different pen weights. So they're definitely fake. They're definitely fake. The question is whether we can prove it in court, and whether we can unwind a real estate transaction that involved innocent third parties. She leaned back in her chair and studied my face. Your brother committed multiple felonies here, Jessica. Forgery, real estate fraud, possibly identity theft, depending on how he obtained the notarization. This isn't just about getting your inheritance back, this is about putting someone in prison. He's still my brother, I said, surprising myself with the words. Even after everything, some part of me was still trying to protect Mike from the consequences of his own choices. He stopped being your brother when he decided to steal from you, Linda said gently. What he did wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, or a family dispute about money. It was a calculated crime that required weeks of planning and multiple illegal acts. He forged legal documents, committed perjury in front of a notary, and defrauded both you and the buyer. She was right, but knowing she was right didn't make the truth any easier to accept. Mike hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen my ability to trust the people I love most. What are my options? We file a police report for the criminal charges and simultaneously file a civil lawsuit to void the real estate transaction. We'll also need to move quickly, because every day that passes makes it harder to unwind what he's done. The new owner has probably already started making improvements to the property, which complicates matters. And Mike is about to discover that actions have consequences, regardless of family relationships. That evening, I called Pat Rodriguez, my father's closest friend and the woman who'd been like an aunt to me since childhood. Pat had worked in banking for 30 years before retiring, and Dad had always trusted her judgment about financial matters. More importantly, she'd been present at several family gatherings where Mike and I had discussed the inheritance, which meant she was a potential witness to the fact that I'd never agreed to any quick sale. Maija, Pat said, when I finished explaining the situation, I'm so sorry this happened to you, but I'm not entirely surprised. What do you mean? Your father was worried about Mike's spending habits in the months before he passed. He mentioned that Mike had asked him for money several times, always with some story about temporary cash flow problems or investment opportunities. Your dad helped him a few times, but he was starting to wonder if Mike had gotten in over his head financially. This was news to me. Dad had never mentioned any concerns about Mike's finances, but then again, Dad was the type to worry privately rather than spread family problems to other people. Did he ever say anything specific? Just that he was glad the house was going to both of you kids equally, because he thought you'd be more responsible with your share than Mike might be with his. He said something once about hoping Mike would grow up and stop chasing get-rich-quick schemes before it was too late. Too late. If Dad had lived another year, he might have changed his will to protect my inheritance from exactly what had happened. Instead, he died trusting that his children would honor his wishes and treat each other fairly. Pat, I need to ask you a favor. I'm going to need you to testify about what you witnessed regarding my intentions about the house. Are you willing to do that? Absolutely. Your father raised you to be honest and hardworking, and he would roll over in his grave if he knew what Mike had done. You fight for what's right, Maija. I'll help however I can. The next morning, Linda and I walked into the Riverside Police Department to file a formal complaint for real estate fraud, forgery, and identity theft. The detective who took our statement, a middle-aged woman named Detective Rodriguez, listened carefully and examined the documents Linda had prepared. This is definitely prosecutable, Detective Rodriguez said. We'll need to interview the notary who allegedly witnessed the signatures, and we'll probably need handwriting analysis to confirm the forgeries, but you've got a strong case here. How long ago did you discover the fraud? 3 days ago, I said. And when did the property sale close? About 3 weeks ago. Detective Rodriguez nodded and made notes in her file. We'll get a warrant to examine your brother's financial records and see where that money went. In fraud cases like this, perpetrators usually spend the proceeds quickly, thinking that makes it harder to recover. What happens now? We investigate, gather evidence, and if the DA decides to prosecute, we arrest your brother and let the courts sort it out. I have to warn you though, family fraud cases can get ugly. Are you prepared for the possibility that your brother might blame you for his legal troubles? I thought about Mike's expensive apartment, and his new television, and his BMW, and his complete lack of remorse when I'd confronted him. My brother made his choices, I said. Now he gets to live with them. 2 days later, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. Mike's name appeared on the caller ID, and when I answered, I could hear panic in his voice like nothing I'd ever heard before. Jess, what the hell did you do? There are police officers at my door with a warrant. Through the phone, I could hear official voices in the background, the sound of someone reading Miranda rights, the distinct noise of handcuffs clicking shut. I reported the crime you committed against me, I said calmly, just like any other victim would do. Crime? Jess, we're family. We work things out between ourselves. We don't involve lawyers and cops in family business. You involved lawyers when you forged my signature on legal documents. You involved cops when you committed multiple felonies. I just made sure they found out about it. The line went quiet except for background voices, and then a different voice came on the phone. Ma'am, this is Detective Rodriguez, with Riverside PD. Your brother asked me to tell you that if you drop the charges, he'll give you half the money from the house sale. Even in handcuffs, even facing felony charges, Mike was still trying to negotiate from a position of weakness, as if he had something to offer me other than what he'd already stolen. Detective Rodriguez, I said, please tell my brother that he doesn't get to steal from me and then act like he's doing me a favor by offering to give back part of what was already mine. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the morning I'd seen that moving truck outside Dad's house, a sense of control over my own life. For weeks, Mike had been managing the narrative, explaining away my concerns, making me feel like I was being unreasonable for asking basic questions about my own inheritance. Now finally, the truth was in charge instead of his lies. The truth, it turned out, was even worse than I'd imagined. Detective Rodriguez called me later that afternoon with an update that made my head spin. Mike hadn't just forged my signature on the house sale documents. When they'd executed the search warrant on his apartment and seized his financial records, they'd discovered a pattern of deception that stretched back months before Dad's death. Your brother had been planning this for a long time, Detective Rodriguez explained over the phone. We found practice sheets where he'd been copying your signature, probably dozens of attempts until he got it perfect. We also found correspondence with the notary, a woman named Susan Walsh, who works at a UPS store downtown. Turns out she notarized those documents without you being present, which is a felony in California. My hands were shaking as I processed this information. Mike hadn't made a desperate, impulsive decision when he found himself in financial trouble. He'd been systematically preparing to steal from me for months, practicing my handwriting like a forger preparing for a heist. There's more, Detective Rodriguez continued. We tracked the money from the house sale. Your brother didn't just spend his half of the proceeds on luxury items, he spent all $425,000. The BMW, the furniture, a 10-day trip to Hawaii, gambling expenses at 3 different casinos, and payments to something called Premier Investment Group, that appears to be a Ponzi scheme that collapsed 2 months ago. All of it, I whispered. All of it. Your brother doesn't have $200,000 to give you, he doesn't have $20,000. According to his bank records, he's got less than $3,000 in checking and savings combined, plus credit card debt that exceeds his annual income. I sat down hard on my couch, trying to absorb the magnitude of Mike's financial catastrophe. He hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen my inheritance, and then lost it all through gambling and investment schemes that any reasonable person would have recognized as scams. What does this mean for getting the house back? That's where it gets complicated. The buyer, Tom Bennett, purchased the property in good faith with no knowledge of the fraud. Under California law, he's considered a bona fide purchaser, which means he has legal rights to the property, even though the sale was based on forged documents. However, your brother is liable for the full value of what he stole from you, plus damages, plus criminal penalties. But he doesn't have any money to pay me back. Not right now, no, but the court can garnish his wages, seize any assets he acquires in the future, and hold him financially responsible for the rest of his life if necessary. Real estate fraud is a serious felony with serious consequences. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment, staring out the window at the parking lot where my 10-year-old Honda Civic looked ancient next to my neighbor's newer cars. Mike had blown through more money in 3 months than I'd earned in 5 years, and now both of us had lost the house that was supposed to secure our financial futures. That evening, Linda Chen called to discuss our legal strategy going forward. The criminal case against Mike was solid, but the civil case to recover my inheritance was more complex. We have several options, she explained. We can sue your brother personally, for the full value of your share, plus punitive damages for the fraud. We can also explore whether Tom Bennett's title insurance might cover some of the loss, since the sale was based on fraudulent documents. And there's a possibility of pursuing the notary's insurance bond, since she failed to properly verify identities before notarizing the forged signatures. What's the most realistic outcome? Honestly, your brother will probably serve 2 to 4 years in prison for the felony charges, and he'll be ordered to pay restitution. But you can't squeeze blood from a stone, Jessica. If he doesn't have assets or income to garnish, you might never see that money. So he wins. He steals everything and loses at gambling, and his only consequence is jail time. Prison is a significant consequence, and the restitution order doesn't disappear just because he can't pay it immediately. If he ever gets a decent job, buys property, receives an inheritance, or wins the lottery, that money belongs to you first. It wasn't the justice I'd been hoping for, but it was something Mike would face real consequences for his choices, even if I never recovered financially from his betrayal. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Mike's attorney requested a meeting to discuss a plea agreement. Linda advised me that this was common in fraud cases, especially when the evidence was overwhelming. They know they can't win at trial, she said. The question is what they're willing to offer in exchange for avoiding the publicity of a full criminal proceeding. We met in the district attorney's office on a Thursday morning that felt like stepping into a television drama. Mike sat at one end of a long conference table with his attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who looked like she specialized in white-collar crime. He'd lost weight since his arrest, and his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it obsessively. This was the first time I'd seen my brother since the night he'd shown me the forged documents in his apartment, and I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the confident real estate agent who always seemed to be closing deals and living his best life. In his place sat a man who looked cornered and desperate, wearing an off-the-rack suit instead of his usual designer clothes. Mike's attorney, Jennifer Walsh, opened the negotiations with an offer that made Linda laugh out loud. Mr. Martinez is prepared to plead guilty to a reduced charge of misdemeanor fraud in exchange for 18 months probation and full restitution to his sister. With what money? Linda responded immediately. Your client spent $425,000 on cars and vacations and gambling. He doesn't have full restitution. He doesn't have partial restitution. He has debt. My client is prepared to make payment arrangements. Your client makes $38,000 a year selling real estate when he's actually working. After taxes, basic living expenses, and the legal obligation to pay child support he's been dodging for 2 years, he might have $200 a month available for restitution. At that rate, he'll finish paying his sister back sometime around 2089. I hadn't known Mike had been avoiding child support payments for his ex-girlfriend's daughter. Another layer of financial irresponsibility that painted a picture of someone who viewed other people's money as his personal emergency fund. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man named David Park, seemed unimpressed with the defense's opening position. Mr. Martinez committed multiple felonies, he said. Identity theft, forgery, real estate fraud, perjury. We're not talking about someone who wrote a bad check. We're talking about someone who spent months planning and executing a complex scheme to defraud his own sister out of her inheritance. The state's position is that he pleads guilty to felony fraud and serves a minimum of 2 years in state prison. Mike spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, looking directly at me. I was in trouble, Jess, real trouble. Some people I owed money to were making threats. I just needed to borrow against my half of the house value, and then when I sold my share, I'd pay you back with interest. You didn't borrow against your share, I said quietly. You stole my share, and you didn't pay me back. You spent it all on yourself. I was going to pay you back. The investment opportunity looked guaranteed. 20% returns in 6 months. I thought I could double the money and surprise you with more than your original inheritance was worth. Linda made a disgusted sound. So your defense is that you committed fraud in order to gamble with stolen money on a scheme that was obviously too good to be true. Mike's attorney put her hand on his arm to stop him from saying anything else that could be used against him, but the damage was already done. He'd just admitted in front of prosecutors and court reporters that he'd stolen my money intentionally, with full knowledge that what he was doing was wrong. My client misspoke, Jennifer Walsh said quickly. What he meant was that he believed he had implied consent from his sister to handle the property transaction, and he intended to share any profits from his business investments. No, I said, surprising everyone including myself with the firmness in my voice. He didn't misspeak, he told the truth for once. He stole my inheritance, he gambled it away, and he's only sorry because he got caught. The room fell silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. Mike looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not anger or defiance, but something that might have been genuine remorse mixed with the dawning realization that his choices had consequences he couldn't charm or negotiate his way out of. "Jessica," he said quietly, "I know I messed up, but I'm still your brother. Doesn't that count for something?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and I realized that everyone in the room was waiting for my answer. The prosecutors wanted to know if family sentiment would make me push for a lighter sentence. The defense attorneys wanted to know if they could leverage family loyalty to their advantage. Mike wanted to know if the relationship we'd shared for 24 years could somehow excuse the fact that he'd betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible. "You stopped being my brother when you decided to steal from me," I said, echoing Linda's words from our first meeting. "A brother would have called me when he was in financial trouble. A brother would have asked for help, not taken what wasn't his to take. What you did wasn't a mistake or a family dispute, it was a crime." Mike's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy I'd grown up with, the one who used to cry when Dad scolded him for breaking something. But that little boy wouldn't have forged legal documents or practiced copying someone else's signature or lied to police officers. That little boy had grown into a man who'd chosen selfishness over integrity at every opportunity. The plea negotiations stalled after that. Mike's attorney requested time to consult with her client, and the prosecutors made it clear that any deal would have to include significant jail time and full restitution, regardless of Mike's ability to pay. Walking out of the courthouse, Linda put her hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing in there," she said. "Family members who enable criminal behavior by making excuses for it just encourage more criminal behavior. Your brother needed to hear that his actions have destroyed his relationship with you." "It doesn't feel good," I admitted. "Even after everything he did, watching him break down like that, he's still the person who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my math homework." "The person who taught you to ride a bike wouldn't have forged your signature on legal documents. That's the tragedy of betrayal, Jessica. It doesn't just steal your money or your property, it steals your memories of who you thought someone was." That afternoon, I drove to Maple Street one more time. Tom Bennett's renovations were already underway. There were construction trucks in the driveway and the sound of power tools echoing from inside the house. The rose bushes Dad had planted were gone, replaced by modern landscaping that looked expensive and impersonal. I parked across the street and sat in my car, looking at the house where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life. The front door was the same forest green Dad had painted it 3 summers ago, but everything else was changing. New windows, new siding, new mailbox with Bennett's name on it instead of Martinez. A part of me wanted to knock on the door and introduce myself to Tom Bennett, to explain that this had been my family's home and that I hadn't willingly agreed to sell it. But what would be the point? He was an innocent buyer who'd purchased the property legally, and he shouldn't have to carry the emotional weight of Mike's betrayal. Instead, I rolled down my windows and listened to the sounds of construction, the hammering and drilling that meant the house was being transformed into something new. Maybe that was fitting, actually. The house I'd grown up in, the house where Dad had built additions and fixed problems and created a sanctuary for his family, was gone the moment Mike decided to sell it without my knowledge. What Tom Bennett was building in its place might be beautiful, but it would never be home to me. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw a photo of a handwritten letter, followed by a message that made my breath catch in my throat. "Jessica, this is Tom Bennett. I got your number from Mrs. Chen next door. I found something while renovating the basement that I think belongs to you. Can you call me when you get a chance?" I dialed the number immediately, my hands shaking as I waited for him to answer. "Mr. Bennett, this is Jessica Martinez. I got your message about finding something in the basement. Please, call me Tom. Listen, I hope this isn't too strange, but I found a metal box hidden behind the water heater in the basement. It was wrapped in plastic and duct tape like someone was trying to protect it from moisture. Inside there's a letter addressed to you, some photographs, and what looks like business documents. I haven't read anything beyond your name on the envelope, but it seemed important. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Dad had hidden something in the basement of the house, something he'd wanted me to find after he was gone. Could I come by and pick it up? I'm actually parked outside right now. Of course, I'll meet you at the front door. Tom Bennett turned out to be a man about my age with kind eyes and work-worn hands that suggested he understood the value of fixing things rather than replacing them. He handed me a metal lockbox that I recognized immediately. Dad had kept important documents in it for as long as I could remember, but I'd never seen it hidden away like this. I'm sorry about the circumstances, Tom said as he handed me the box. Mrs. Chen told me what happened with your brother. I had no idea the sale involved fraud when I bought the house. It's not your fault, I assured him. You're an innocent buyer. I hope Mike's actions don't cause legal problems for you. My attorney says I should be protected as a good faith purchaser, but I wanted you to know that if there's anything in the house that has sentimental value to your family, you're welcome to take it. I found some family photos in the closets and some tools in the garage that look like they were well loved. The kindness in his voice almost broke me. Here was a stranger showing more consideration for my feelings than my own brother had when he'd stolen my inheritance. Thank you, I managed to say. That means more than you know. Back in my car, I opened the lockbox with shaking fingers. Inside, exactly as Tom had described, was a letter addressed to me, in Dad's careful handwriting, along with photographs and business documents I'd never seen before. The letter was dated 3 months before Dad's heart attack, written in the blue ink he always used for important documents. My dear Jessica, it began, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've had time to discover what kind of man your brother really is. I hope I'm wrong about Mike, but I've been watching his behavior for the past year, and I'm worried that he's gotten involved with dangerous people and dangerous financial schemes. I had to stop reading to wipe tears from my eyes. Even in death, Dad had been trying to protect me from Mike's selfishness. I've been keeping records of the money I've lent Mike and the lies he's told me about why he needed it. Some of these documents might be helpful if he ever tries to claim that family money belongs to him. More importantly, I want you to know that whatever he might say or do after I'm gone, you don't owe him anything just because he's your brother. Blood doesn't excuse betrayal, sweetheart. Stand up for yourself the way I taught you to stand up for what's right. The business documents in the box were loan agreements between Dad and Mike, dating back 2 years before Dad's death. Mike had borrowed over $40,000 from our father, always with promises to pay it back quickly, always with stories about temporary cash flow problems or investment opportunities that required immediate capital. But the most damaging document was a handwritten confession from Mike, dated just 6 weeks before Dad died. In his own writing, Mike had admitted to taking money from Dad's business account without permission to cover gambling debts, and he'd promised to pay it back before Dad noticed. I know what I did was stealing, Mike had written. I know I've lost your trust, and I probably don't deserve another chance, but I'm in real trouble with some people, and if I don't pay them back, they're going to hurt me. I'll work extra hours at the real estate office and pay you back every penny, plus interest. I just need time to get back on my feet. Dad had kept this confession in his lockbox, along with bank records, showing that the money had never been repaid. Mike hadn't started stealing from family when he'd forged my signature on the house sale documents. He'd been stealing from Dad for years, and Dad had been quietly documenting it all. The photographs in the box were pictures I'd never seen before, images of damage to Dad's construction equipment that looked deliberate rather than accidental, notes in Dad's handwriting describing tools that had gone missing from job sites, always when Mike had been helping with projects, a timeline of incidents that painted a picture of someone systematically taking advantage of our father's trust and generosity. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope marked for the police if something happens to me. Inside was a letter detailing threats Mike had made against Dad when he'd refused to lend him more money. Nothing specific enough to be considered a direct threat of violence, but enough to suggest that Mike had been pressuring our father with increasingly desperate demands for cash right up until his death. "I don't think Mike would actually hurt me," Dad had written, "but I've learned that desperate people do desperate things. If something happens to me unexpectedly, please make sure the police know that Mike has been under financial pressure from people who don't accept excuses or payment plans." I closed the envelope with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Dad hadn't just died of a heart attack, he died while being emotionally terrorized by his own son, worried that his financial support wasn't enough to keep Mike safe from the consequences of his gambling addiction. Sitting in my car outside the house that was no longer mine, reading letters from a father who'd been trying to protect me even after death, I felt something shift inside my chest, not just anger at Mike's betrayal, but a deep, crushing grief for the man who'd spent his final months afraid of his own son. Mike hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen Dad's peace of mind in his final weeks of life, pressuring him for money, while Dad was battling the heart problems that would eventually kill him. That evening, I called Linda Chen and Detective Rodriguez and arranged for them to examine the contents of Dad's lockbox. The new evidence wouldn't change the charges against Mike, but it would provide additional context for his pattern of criminal behavior and might influence his sentencing. But more than that, it gave me something I hadn't expected to find: confirmation that I was doing the right thing by holding Mike accountable for his choices. Dad had been documenting Mike's theft and manipulation not because he wanted to see his son punished, but because he wanted to protect his daughter from becoming the next victim. Even facing his own mortality, even loving both his children, he'd had the wisdom to recognize that enabling criminal behavior wasn't the same as showing family loyalty. The man who taught me to stand up for what was right had spent his final months standing up to someone he loved, someone who was taking advantage of his love. The least I could do was honor his memory by refusing to let that pattern continue. Mike had made his choices, now he would live with the consequences, just like any other criminal who preyed on people who trusted him. The difference was that this time, his victim had a father who taught her to fight back. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Mike sat at the defendant's table, wearing the same off-the-rack suit from the plea negotiations, but he looked even thinner now, like someone who hadn't been sleeping or eating properly for weeks. His attorney, Jennifer Walsh, had a stack of character reference letters that she kept shuffling through nervously. Judge Catherine Williams was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd reviewed all the evidence Linda and I had provided, including the contents of Dad's lockbox, and her expression suggested she wasn't impressed with the defense's attempts to minimize Mike's crimes. The sentencing hearing had been delayed twice because Mike kept firing and hiring new attorneys, each one promising they could get him a better deal. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution had been unwilling to negotiate beyond their original offer of felony fraud charges with mandatory restitution. Linda sat beside me in the gallery, her briefcase full of victim impact statements and financial documentation. Over the past month, she'd helped me calculate not just the immediate loss of my inheritance, but the long-term financial impact of Mike's theft. The $200,000 I should have received could have been invested, could have eliminated my student loans, could have provided the down payment for my own home. Instead, I was still living in my studio apartment, still stretching every paycheck, still watching my friends move forward with their lives while I dealt with the wreckage Mike had left behind. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Williams entered with the bearing of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human selfishness and wasn't easily fooled by sob stories. The prosecutor, David Park, presented the state's case with clinical precision. Multiple felony counts of fraud, forgery, and identity theft, evidence of premeditation spanning several months, a victim who trusted the defendant completely and been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect her interests. "Your Honor," Park said, "this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a family dispute that got out of hand. Mr. Martinez spent months planning and executing a sophisticated fraud scheme against his own sister, He practiced forging her signature, he recruited accomplices to notarize fraudulent documents, and he spent the proceeds on luxury items and gambling while allowing his victim to believe the inheritance was still secure. Jennifer Walsh stood to present Mike's defense, and I could tell from her body language that she knew she was fighting a losing battle. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he made serious mistakes in judgment. He was facing financial pressures that led him to make desperate choices. Mr. Martinez has no prior criminal record, and he's expressed genuine remorse for the pain he's caused his family. We respectfully request that the court consider suspended sentencing with restitution and community service. Judge Williams looked unimpressed. Miss Walsh, your client didn't make mistakes in judgment, he committed multiple felonies over an extended period of time. The evidence shows clear premeditation, elaborate planning, and a complete disregard for both the law and his sister's rights. What's your client's position on restitution? Your Honor, my client is committed to making full restitution, but his current financial situation makes immediate payment impossible. We propose a payment plan that would allow Miss Walsh. The judge interrupted. Your client spent $425,000 in 3 months. He bought luxury cars, took expensive vacations, and gambled away money that didn't belong to him. Now he wants the court to accommodate his inability to pay back what he stole. That's not how justice works. The judge then called me forward to read my victim impact statement. I'd written and rewritten it a dozen times, trying to capture not just the financial damage Mike had caused, but the deeper betrayal of trust and family bonds. Standing at the podium, looking at Mike for the first time since the plea negotiations, I saw a man who looked defeated but not necessarily sorry. His eyes kept darting around the courtroom, as if he were looking for escape routes, or calculating his chances of avoiding serious consequences. Your Honor, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Mike Martinez isn't just someone who committed fraud against me, he's my older brother, someone I trusted completely, someone I looked up to my entire life. When our father died, Mike convinced me that he would handle the inheritance paperwork because he understood real estate transactions better than I did. I believed him because he was my brother, and I thought that meant something. I paused, looking directly at Mike. Over the past few months, I've discovered that Mike had been stealing from our father for years before Dad died. He'd taken money from Dad's business accounts, borrowed thousands of dollars with no intention of paying it back, and even threatened our father when Dad tried to set financial boundaries. Our father spent his final months being extorted by his own son, and he died worrying about what Mike might do to me after he was gone. Mike's attorney touched his arm, probably advising him not to react, but I could see his face reddening with what looked like anger rather than shame. The financial impact of Mike's theft is significant. He stole my half of our family home, which represented not just money, but my connection to my father's memory and my own financial security. But the deeper damage is the destruction of family trust. Mike didn't just steal my inheritance, he stole my ability to trust the people I love most. He stole my sense of safety in the world. He stole years of my life that I'll spend rebuilding from damage he caused deliberately. I looked back at the judge. Your Honor, I'm not here seeking revenge against my brother. I'm here seeking justice for crimes that Mike planned and executed with complete disregard for anyone but himself. He had multiple opportunities to ask for help with his financial problems, but instead, he chose to steal from family members who would have supported him if he'd been honest about his situation. Thank you, Miss Martinez, Judge Williams said. Mr. Martinez, please stand for sentencing. Mike stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment, I could see the little boy he'd once been, standing in front of Dad, after breaking something valuable. But this wasn't a broken vase, or a damaged toy, this was a broken family, and a damaged life, and the consequences would be proportional to the crime. Mr. Martinez, Judge Williams began, I've reviewed all the evidence in this case, including the documentation your victim provided about your history of financial crimes against family members. What you did wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by temporary financial stress, it was a calculated, sophisticated fraud that required months of planning and multiple criminal acts. Mike's shoulders slumped as the judge continued. You forged legal documents, committed perjury, recruited accomplices, and stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from someone who trusted you completely. Then you spent that money on luxury items and gambling while allowing your victim to believe her inheritance was secure. This represents a fundamental betrayal of family trust and a complete disregard for both the law and your sister's welfare. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft sound of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. On the charge of felony real estate fraud, I sentence you to 3 years in state prison. On the charge of identity theft, I sentence you to 2 years in state prison to run concurrently. On the charge of forgery, I sentence you to 18 months in state prison, also concurrent. You are hereby ordered to pay full restitution in the amount of $425,000 plus interest and court costs. Mike's knees buckled slightly, and his attorney grabbed his arm to steady him. 3 years in prison. It was more than his attorney had hoped for, but less than the maximum sentence for his crimes. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, upon your release from prison, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation, during which time you are prohibited from handling real estate transactions, accessing other people's financial accounts, or co-signing any legal documents. Any violation of these terms will result in additional prison time. The judge's gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom like a door slamming shut. Mike turned to look at me one last time before the bailiff approached with handcuffs, and his expression was something I'd never seen before, not anger or remorse, but a kind of blank shock, as if he were just now understanding that his choices had permanent consequences. Jess, he called out as the bailiff led him toward the door that would take him back to county jail to await transport to state prison. I'm sorry, I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to someone who'd had countless opportunities to make different choices and had consistently chosen selfishness over integrity. Mike was sorry he'd been caught, sorry he was facing consequences, but he wasn't sorry for what he'd done to me or to Dad. Outside the courthouse, Linda and I sat on the steps in the afternoon sunshine, watching normal people go about their normal lives, while I processed the surreal experience of watching my brother be sentenced to prison. How do you feel? Linda asked. Empty, I said honestly, not satisfied, not vindicated, just empty, like I've been carrying something heavy for months, and I finally put it down, but now I don't know what to do with my hands. That's normal after a long legal battle. You've been focused on getting justice for so long that it's hard to know what comes next. What does come next? Mike doesn't have any money to pay restitution, and he won't be earning much in prison, even when he gets out. How much can the court realistically garnish from a minimum wage job? Linda sighed. Honestly, you might never recover the full amount, but the restitution order doesn't disappear just because he can't pay it immediately. If he ever gets a good job, inherits money, or comes into any significant assets, that money belongs to you first. So I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life hoping my brother gets rich enough to pay me back for stealing from me. You're supposed to spend the rest of your life building the future you want, regardless of whether Mike ever makes you financially whole. The court case was about justice and accountability. Your actual recovery has to come from your own choices and your own strength. That evening, I drove to Dad's grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, except for the sound of sprinklers watering the grass and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Dad's headstone was simple granite, with his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Father and Friend." I sat down on the grass beside the marker, and pulled out the letter he'd written me, the one I'd found in his lockbox. Reading it again in this place, I could almost hear his voice, in the words he'd chosen so carefully. I did what you taught me, Dad, I said aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious about talking to a grave. I stood up for myself. I didn't let Mike get away with stealing from him. But I don't know what to do now. The house is gone, the money is gone, and Mike is going to prison. Everyone lost. A breeze rustled through the oak trees that lined the cemetery, and I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Dad before his heart attack. He'd been worried about Mike's financial problems, but he'd also been excited about my job prospects and my plans for the future. Dad had always believed I was capable of more than I believed about myself. You raised me to work for what I wanted instead of waiting for other people to give it to me, I continued. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do now. Stop waiting for Mike to make this right and start making it right myself. The idea that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks suddenly crystallized into something that felt like a plan rather than a wish. I couldn't get Dad's house back, and I might never recover my inheritance, but I could use what I'd learned from this experience to help other people avoid similar betrayals. Over the next few days, I started researching organizations that helped families deal with financial fraud and elder abuse. What I discovered was that Mike's crimes weren't unusual. Family members stealing from each other was actually one of the most common forms of financial fraud, and it was also one of the least prosecuted because victims were often reluctant to report crimes committed by people they loved. I reached out to several nonprofit organizations that focused on financial abuse prevention, offering to share my story and the lessons I'd learned about protecting inherited assets. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Apparently, there was a real need for educational programs that helped people recognize and prevent family financial fraud. My first speaking engagement was at a community center in downtown Riverside, addressing a support group for people who'd been victims of financial crimes. I was nervous walking into that room full of strangers, but when I started telling my story, I could see recognition in their faces. The woman whose nephew had stolen her Social Security checks, the man whose business partner had emptied their joint accounts, the elderly couple whose son had forged their signatures on a reverse mortgage. The hardest part, I told them, wasn't losing the money. It was accepting that someone I loved had deliberately chosen to hurt me. We want to believe that family members who steal from us are just desperate or confused or temporarily making bad choices. But the truth is that people who commit financial fraud against family members are making calculated decisions to prioritize their own wants over other people's needs. After the presentation, a woman named Maria approached me. She was probably in her 70s, well-dressed but with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been dealing with stress for a long time. My grandson has been asking me to sign papers related to my house, she said quietly. He says it's just to help with property taxes, but something feels wrong. After hearing your story, I'm wondering if I should have someone else look at those documents before I sign anything. Absolutely, I said, pulling out one of Linda Chen's business cards. Don't sign anything until you've had an independent attorney review it. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. 6 months later, Maria called to thank me. Her grandson had been trying to get her to sign over her property deed under the pretense of helping her avoid tax penalties. An attorney review had revealed that the documents would have transferred complete ownership of her home to the grandson, leaving her with no legal rights to the property she'd owned for 40 years. You saved my home, Maria told me over the phone. If I hadn't heard your story, I would have signed those papers because I trusted him. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't mean blind trust. Stories like Maria's started multiplying as I spoke to more groups and connected with more organizations. People would approach me after presentations with their own experiences of financial betrayal, and I began to see patterns in how family financial fraud typically developed. It usually started with small boundary violations, borrowing money without asking, taking items without permission, pressuring family members to make financial decisions quickly without time for consideration. Then it escalated to more serious crimes like forging signatures, accessing accounts without authorization, or manipulating legal documents. The victims were usually people who valued family relationships and wanted to trust the people they loved. The perpetrators were usually people who felt entitled to other people's resources and who had learned that family members were less likely to report crimes or press charges. Most importantly, I learned that these crimes were almost always preventable if people knew what warning signs to look for and felt empowered to set financial boundaries with family members. Working with Linda Chen, I developed a presentation called Protecting Your Legacy, Recognizing and Preventing Family Financial Fraud. We started offering it to community groups, senior centers, and estate planning attorneys who wanted to educate their clients about protecting inherited assets. The presentation covered practical strategies like requiring independent attorney review for any legal documents, setting up financial safeguards that required multiple signatures for large transactions, and recognizing manipulation tactics that fraudsters use to pressure victims into making quick decisions. But the most important part of the presentation was the emotional component, helping people understand that protecting yourself from financial fraud isn't about being suspicious of family members, it's about being responsible to yourself and to the people who depend on you. My father worked for 30 years to build the inheritance he left me and my brother, I would tell audiences. When Mike stole that money, he wasn't just stealing from me. He was stealing from Dad's legacy and from the future Dad had wanted to provide for his children. Protecting your assets isn't selfish, it's honoring the people who worked to build those assets and ensuring they can benefit the people they were intended to help. The presentations led to consulting opportunities with elder law attorneys who wanted help identifying clients who might be at risk for family financial fraud. Banks started inviting me to train their staff on recognizing signs that customers might be victims of financial manipulation by family members. A year after Mike's sentencing, I was invited to speak at a conference for estate planning attorneys in Los Angeles. The audience was more than 200 professionals who worked with families to protect wealth and transfer assets between generations. Standing at the podium in a hotel ballroom that could have held 10 of my studio apartment, I thought about how different my life had become since the morning I'd seen that moving truck outside Dad's house. I was still living in the same small apartment, still working the same entry-level job, still dealing with the financial consequences of Mike's theft. But I was also helping people protect themselves from similar betrayals, and that work was giving my experience a purpose I'd never expected to find. Financial fraud within families is often called a crime of trust, I told the conference attendees. But I've learned that it's actually a crime of exploitation. The people who commit these crimes aren't violating trust accidentally, they're deliberately weaponizing trust to achieve their goals. After my presentation, a woman approached me with a business card that made my heart skip. Dr. Sandra Rivera, Director of Financial Crimes Prevention, California Department of Consumer Affairs. Miss Martinez, she said, we've been following your work through the presentations you've been giving throughout California. We're developing a statewide program to combat family financial fraud, and we'd like you to consider joining our team as a victim advocate and education specialist. The job offer was everything I'd never known I wanted. A chance to work full-time helping people avoid the kind of betrayal I'd experienced. A salary that would let me move out of my studio apartment and start building the financial security Mike had stolen from me. Most importantly, an opportunity to turn Dad's tragedy into something that could protect other families. But taking the job would mean leaving Riverside, leaving the community where I'd started speaking about family financial fraud, leaving the support system I'd built during the darkest period of my life. Can I have some time to think about it? I asked. Of course, but I hope you'll seriously consider it. The state needs people who understand both the legal and emotional aspects of family financial fraud. Your personal experience combined with your educational work makes you exactly the kind of advocate we need. That night, I sat in my apartment looking out the window at the parking lot where I'd spent so many evenings wondering how I'd ended up rebuilding my life from scratch because of my brother's selfishness. The job offer represented a chance to transform my experience into something meaningful, to ensure that Dad's legacy included protecting other families from what we'd been through. Mike was 2 years into his prison sentence, working in the laundry facility for 40 cents an hour. According to the Department of Corrections, he'd be eligible for parole in 8 months if he continued to demonstrate good behavior. Even if he worked full-time at minimum wage after his release, the restitution payments would be minimal, maybe $50 a month after his basic living expenses. I would probably never recover my inheritance, but I'd discovered something Dad couldn't have anticipated when he hid that lockbox in the basement. Sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't money or property, it's the strength to turn pain into purpose and to use your own experience to prevent others from suffering similar harm. The next morning, I called Dr. Rivera and accepted the position. It was time to stop waiting for Mike to make things right and start making things right for other people who deserved better than being betrayed by the people they trusted most. The California Department of Consumer Affairs office in Sacramento felt like stepping into a different universe. Glass and steel architecture that reached toward endless blue skies, conference rooms equipped with technology I'd only seen in movies, and colleagues who spoke casually about budget allocations that exceeded everything I'd ever owned combined. My new title was Senior Victim Advocate and Education Specialist, which sounded impressive enough to make Dad proud if he could have heard it.
Doctor.
Sandra Rivera gave me the tour on my first day, walking me through departments that tackled everything from contractor fraud to investment scams to the kind of family financial abuse that had destroyed my own sense of security. The Family Financial Crimes Unit occupied an entire floor, with investigators, attorneys and social workers who dedicated their careers to protecting people from the exact betrayals I'd experienced. "Your office is here, Doctor," Rivera said, opening the door to a space that was larger than my entire studio apartment had been. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the state capitol building, and the desk was bigger than any furniture I'd ever owned. "We've allocated funding for you to travel throughout California giving presentations to community groups, training law enforcement officers, and consulting with district attorneys on prosecution strategies for family fraud cases." The magnitude of what I'd committed to hit me as I sat in that leather desk chair, looking out at a city I barely knew, preparing to take on a job that felt simultaneously perfect and completely overwhelming. 2 years ago, I'd been a recent college graduate living paycheck to paycheck, trusting my brother to handle paperwork I didn't understand. Now I was supposed to be an expert helping other people avoid the mistakes that had cost me everything. My first assignment was developing a comprehensive training program for bank employees who might encounter customers being pressured into financial transactions by family members. The research phase meant reading hundreds of case files detailing every conceivable variation of family financial abuse, and each file felt like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own experience. There was Margaret Chen, an 80-year-old woman whose daughter had convinced her to take out a home equity loan to fund a business venture that existed only on paper. Robert Martinez, a widower whose son had gradually gained access to his bank accounts by claiming he was helping with bill payments, then systematically drained 40 years of savings. Patricia Rodriguez, whose nephew had forged her signature on insurance documents and collected death benefits while she was still alive. The names weren't what made my hands shake as I read through those files, it was the patterns. The same manipulation tactics Mike had used on me appeared in case after case after case. Family members who claimed they were helping while actually stealing, victims who trusted completely until the moment they discovered the betrayal, perpetrators who expressed remorse only after getting caught and never before choosing to commit their crimes. But the most heartbreaking similarity was how long it took most victims to report the crimes. Months or years of making excuses for family members who were systematically destroying their financial security, children who forgave parents for stealing their college funds, parents who refused to press charges against children who'd emptied their retirement accounts, spouses who blamed themselves for trusting partners who'd forged their signatures on mortgage documents. The average family financial fraud case involves 17 months of ongoing theft before the victim reports the crime, Dr. Rivera explained during one of our planning meetings. That's not because the victims don't notice money missing or documents being forged, it's because they keep hoping the family member will confess and make things right voluntarily. I thought about the months I'd spent asking Mike about timeline delays and market complications, accepting his explanations even when they didn't make sense, because I wanted to believe my brother was protecting my interests rather than stealing from me. If Mrs. Chen hadn't mentioned the sale, I might have waited even longer to investigate, giving Mike additional time to cover his tracks or dispose of evidence. "What's the solution?" I asked. How do we teach people to recognize betrayal faster when their instinct is to trust family members? That's exactly what we're hoping your program will address. You have credibility with victims that law enforcement officers and financial professionals don't have. You've lived through the emotional journey from trust to suspicion to acceptance. People will listen to you in ways they won't listen to investigators who haven't experienced family betrayal personally. The training program I developed focused on 3 key areas: recognizing warning signs, implementing protective strategies, and responding effectively when family financial abuse was discovered. But the heart of the program was something that couldn't be taught through PowerPoint presentations or legal procedures: the emotional component of accepting that people you love might deliberately choose to harm you. Family financial fraud isn't about money, I would tell audiences of bank tellers and customer service representatives. It's about power and entitlement and the exploitation of love. When someone uses your love for them as a weapon against you, the financial loss is often the least devastating part of the crime. The training sessions took me all over California, from community centers in rural farming towns to corporate boardrooms in San Francisco. I spoke to retirement communities full of people who'd worked their entire lives to build financial security, and to young professionals who were just beginning to accumulate assets worth stealing. In Fresno, I met Elena Vasquez, whose adult son had been gradually transferring money from her savings account by claiming he was helping her manage her finances online. She'd noticed the diminishing balances but trusted his explanations about market fluctuations and account maintenance fees. I raised him to be honest, Elena told me after my presentation. I taught him the difference between right and wrong. How could he look me in the eye and lie so easily? Because people who commit financial fraud against family members aren't making emotional decisions, I explained. They're making calculated choices based on what they think they can get away with. Your son didn't lie to you because you failed as a parent. He lied because he decided his wants were more important than your trust. In San Diego, I trained a group of estate planning attorneys who were seeing an increase in clients whose family members were pressuring them to change wills or transfer property before death. The attorneys wanted to know how to identify clients who might be victims of financial manipulation without making accusations that could destroy family relationships if they were wrong. The key is asking open-ended questions that give people permission to express concerns they might be suppressing. I advised them, instead of asking "Is anyone pressuring you to change your will?" try asking, "How do you feel about your family's reaction to your estate planning decisions?" People who are being manipulated often have instincts that something is wrong, but they need someone to validate those feelings. 6 months into the job, I received a call that reminded me why this work mattered beyond statistics and training programs. Maria Santos, the woman I'd met at my first community center presentation, was calling to update me on her situation. "Jessica, I wanted you to know that my grandson tried again last month," she said. "He brought different papers this time, claiming my house needed to be transferred to him to qualify for some kind of senior property tax exemption. But I remembered what you taught me about trusting my instincts, and I had my attorney review the documents first." "What did you find out?" "There is no senior property tax exemption that requires transferring property to family members. The documents my grandson brought would have given him complete ownership of my house, while leaving me responsible for all the maintenance costs and property taxes. Basically, I would have been paying to live in a house he owned." Maria's voice was steady, but I could hear the hurt underneath her matter-of-fact tone. Discovering that a family member you love is trying to steal from you doesn't get easier just because you're prepared for it. "How are you handling this emotionally?" I asked. "It's hard," she admitted. "I keep thinking about the little boy I used to read bedtime stories to, wondering how he turned into someone who could plan something so elaborate to hurt me, but I'm also grateful that I knew enough to protect myself. If I hadn't heard your story, I would have signed those papers because I trusted him." Maria's experience was being repeated across California as more people learned to recognize and respond to family financial manipulation. Bank employees who attended my training sessions started identifying customers who were being pressured into unusual transactions. Estate planning attorneys began asking more targeted questions about family dynamics during will consultations. Adult protective services workers felt more confident investigating reports of financial abuse against elderly clients. But the most satisfying feedback came from potential victims who'd protected themselves before crimes could be completed. People like David Kim, who'd refused to co-sign a loan for his nephew after attending one of my presentations. Jennifer Walsh, who'd consulted an attorney before agreeing to help her sister with mortgage paperwork that turned out to be a reverse mortgage application. Robert Chen, who discovered his brother was using his identity to open credit card accounts and had reported the fraud immediately instead of trying to handle it privately. The goal isn't to make people suspicious of their families, I would explain to audiences who worried that financial fraud prevention might damage family relationships. The goal is to help people understand that protecting your assets isn't about not trusting family members, it's about creating systems that make it unnecessary to choose between trust and security. The work was emotionally demanding in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every case file reminded me of my own experience with Mike, and every victim I spoke with was processing the same sense of betrayal and disbelief I'd felt when I'd discovered the forged documents. Some days I went home to my new apartment, a one-bedroom place with a view of the Sacramento River, feeling like I'd absorbed the pain of dozens of people who were just beginning to understand how completely their trust had been violated. But there were also moments of profound satisfaction, when Elena Vasquez called to tell me she'd successfully recovered $60,000 her son had stolen because she'd reported the theft quickly enough for banks to reverse the fraudulent transfers. When Maria Santos decided to volunteer with a senior advocacy group, using her experience to help other elderly people recognize financial manipulation. When Dr. Rivera showed me statistics indicating that family financial fraud reports had increased by 30% in California, which actually meant that more victims were getting help instead of suffering in silence. The success of the California program attracted attention from other states that wanted to implement similar initiatives. I started traveling outside California, consulting with government agencies in Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon that were developing their own family financial fraud prevention programs. During a conference in Portland, I met Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher who'd been studying the long-term psychological effects of family financial betrayal. Her findings confirmed what I'd intuited from my own experience and the victims I'd worked with. Family financial fraud creates a specific type of trauma that's different from stranger-perpetrated crimes, Dr. Williams explained. Victims don't just lose money or property, they lose their ability to trust their own judgment about people they love. The recovery process involves not just replacing stolen assets, but rebuilding the capacity to form trusting relationships. Her research showed that victims who channeled their experience into helping others recovered faster and more completely than victims who focused solely on personal healing or revenge against perpetrators. There was something about transforming individual trauma into community service that accelerated the psychological recovery process. Your work with the state agency is actually a form of therapy, Dr. Williams told me. By helping other people avoid what you experienced, you're proving to yourself that your experience had meaning beyond just being victimized. You're creating purpose from pain. 3 years into my state job, I received news that I'd been both expecting and dreading. Mike was being released from prison after serving his full sentence with good behavior credit. His parole officer had contacted me as part of the victim notification process to let me know he'd be returning to Riverside County and would be required to check in regularly as part of his supervised release conditions. Has he made any restitution payments while incarcerated? I asked. He's earned approximately $400 during his incarceration and has paid that entire amount toward restitution, as required by law. His current balance owed is $424,600 plus accrued interest. $400. Over 3 years, Mike had managed to pay me back less money than he used to spend on a single dinner at the expensive restaurants he'd frequented before his arrest. The restitution order was essentially meaningless when applied to someone who had no assets and no realistic prospects for earning enough income to make meaningful payments. But something surprising happened when I thought about Mike returning to the world outside prison. I didn't feel angry or afraid or vengeful. I felt something closer to indifference, as if he were someone I'd read about in a case file rather than someone who'd shared my childhood and destroyed my financial security. The Jessica Martinez, who'd confronted Mike in his expensive apartment 4 years ago, had been desperate for him to acknowledge what he'd done and make things right between us. The Jessica Martinez, who'd testified at his sentencing hearing, had been focused on ensuring he faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. But this Jessica Martinez, the one who'd spent years helping other families protect themselves from similar betrayals, understood that Mike's choices and Mike's future were completely separate from my own recovery and happiness. Trauma recovery isn't about forgiving the person who hurt you, Dr. Williams had explained during one of our conversations. It's about reaching a point where their choices no longer control your emotional state. You know you're healing when you can think about the person who betrayed you without it affecting your mood or your day. I realized that's exactly what had happened. Mike had become someone whose life and decisions were irrelevant to my own well-being. Whether he succeeded or failed after his release from prison, whether he found stable employment or returned to gambling and financial schemes, whether he ever acknowledged the damage he'd caused or continued blaming external circumstances for his choices, none of that mattered to the life I'd built or the work I was doing. The notification letter included information about victim impact rights during Mike's parole period. I could request that he be prohibited from contacting me, that he stay away from my workplace and residence, that he be required to notify his parole officer if he wanted to travel to Sacramento for any reason. But exercising those rights would mean Mike's presence in the world was still affecting my decisions, still requiring me to spend time and energy thinking about him. Instead, I filed the notification letter in my desk drawer and went back to work on a training presentation for credit union employees in Bakersfield. Mike's release from prison was just another piece of information, no more significant to my daily life than weather reports from cities I'd never visit. That evening, I called Linda Chen to update her on the notification and to thank her again for the legal representation that had made everything else possible. "How do you feel about him being released?" she asked. "I don't really feel anything," I said honestly. "Is that weird? Shouldn't I be angry that he's getting out of prison while I'm still dealing with the financial consequences of what he did?" "It sounds like you've reached the healthiest possible outcome," Linda said. "You're not responsible for monitoring his behavior or ensuring he faces ongoing consequences. You did your part by reporting the crime and testifying at his trial. Everything that happens to him now is between him and the justice system." I keep thinking about something my father wrote in one of those letters I found. He said that loving someone doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior from them. I think I finally understand what he meant. What do you mean? I can acknowledge that Mike is my brother and that I have memories of caring about him, while also accepting that he's someone who makes choices that are harmful to other people. Those two things can be true at the same time, without creating any obligation for me to remain emotionally invested in his life. The conversation with Linda clarified something I'd been processing subconsciously for months. My recovery from Mike's betrayal wasn't dependent on him acknowledging what he'd done, apologizing for the harm he'd caused, or successfully paying restitution. My recovery was dependent on rebuilding my own sense of security and purpose, which had happened through the work I was doing to protect other families. 6 months after Mike's release, I received a letter forwarded through the state agency's Victim Services Department. The return address showed it was from Mike, but there was no requirement that I read correspondence from him, and my initial instinct was to throw it away unopened. But curiosity won out, and I opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter on plain paper that looked like it came from a discount store. "Jessica," it began, "I know I don't have the right to contact you, and I understand if you don't want to read this. I've been out of prison for 6 months now, working at a warehouse and living in a halfway house, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life after the mess I made of everything." The letter went on for 2 pages, describing Mike's current circumstances and his participation in a financial responsibility counseling program required by his parole conditions. He was earning minimum wage, paying a portion of his income toward restitution, and living with strict supervision that monitored all his financial activities. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix what I did to you or bring back the money I stole, he wrote. I know I destroyed your trust and probably destroyed any chance of us having a normal brother-sister relationship. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to try to explain away my choices. I'm writing because I want you to know that I understand now how much damage I caused. The letter described some of the other inmates Mike had met in prison, including several who'd committed similar crimes against family members. Through conversations with them and mandatory counseling sessions, he'd begun to understand that his actions had been part of a pattern of entitlement and financial irresponsibility that stretched back years before Dad's death. I told myself I was borrowing money I'd pay back, but I was really stealing money I had no realistic plan to replace, he wrote. I told myself you wouldn't mind sharing the inheritance, but I was really deciding that my problems were more important than your rights. I told myself I was protecting you from stress and complicated paperwork, but I was really protecting myself from having to ask permission for things I knew you wouldn't agree to. The final paragraph was the most honest thing Mike had ever written to me. I don't expect you to forgive me or want a relationship with me. I know I lost the right to be your brother when I decided to steal from you, but I want you to know that seeing the consequences of what I did, not just the prison time, but losing you and losing any connection to Dad's memory, has changed how I think about the choices I make. I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can make sure I never hurt anyone like that again. Reading Mike's letter didn't make me feel angry or sad or vindicated. It felt like receiving an update about a stranger whose story had briefly intersected with mine. The remorse he expressed seemed genuine, but it was also irrelevant to my current life in the same way that an apology from someone who'd hit your car 5 years ago would be irrelevant to your current transportation needs. I filed the letter in the same drawer where I'd put the prison release notification and didn't respond to it. Not out of anger or spite, but because there was nothing to say that would serve any useful purpose. Mike's journey toward accountability and different choices was his responsibility, not something that required my participation or validation. A year later, Dr. Rivera approached me with an opportunity that felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned about family financial fraud and recovery. The Department of Justice is funding a national task force on family financial crimes, she explained. They want to develop federal guidelines for prosecution, prevention, and victim services. The task force needs someone who understands both the legal aspects and the victim experience. Would you be interested in applying for the director position? The job would mean moving to Washington, D.C., leading a team of investigators and advocates, and influencing policy at the federal level. It was a level of professional responsibility I'd never imagined for myself, but it also felt like the natural next step in transforming my experience into something that could help families nationwide. What kind of impact could a program like this have? I asked. Conservative estimates suggest that family financial fraud costs American families over $8 billion annually, Dr. Rivera said. But the actual cost is probably much higher because most cases go unreported. A national program could standardize prevention education, improve prosecution rates, and provide better support services for victims. You could potentially prevent thousands of families from experiencing what you went through. The application process was extensive, requiring detailed proposals for program structure, budget allocation, and outcome measurements. But writing those proposals felt like creating a blueprint for the kind of support system I'd wished existed when I first discovered Mike's betrayal. The interview process brought me to Washington, D.C. for the first time, where I presented my vision to a panel that included representatives from the FBI, the Federal Trade Commission, and victim advocacy organizations from across the country. Family financial fraud is different from other financial crimes because it exploits the victim's love and trust. I explained to the panel, traditional law enforcement approaches that focus solely on investigation and prosecution miss the emotional component that makes these crimes so devastating and so difficult to report. What would you do differently? Asked Special Agent Maria Rodriguez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I'd integrate victim services into every stage of the process from initial reporting through prosecution and recovery. Victims of family financial fraud need emotional support to process the betrayal, practical assistance to understand their legal options, and long-term advocacy to navigate the financial recovery process. Most importantly, they need to know that they're not responsible for preventing crimes committed by people they trusted. 6 weeks later, I received a call offering me the position. The salary was more than I'd ever imagined earning, the responsibilities were both exciting and intimidating, and the opportunity to influence policy at the federal level felt like honoring Dad's memory in ways I'd never anticipated. But accepting the job would mean leaving California, leaving the community of colleagues and friends who'd supported me through the most difficult period of my life, and taking on challenges that were exponentially more complex than anything I'd handled before. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. I hadn't visited his grave in over a year, not because I'd forgotten him or moved on from grieving, but because I'd found other ways to feel connected to his memory through the work I was doing. Sitting on the grass beside his headstone, I thought about the conversation we might have had if he'd lived to see how Mike's betrayal had ultimately led to my career in victim advocacy. "I think you'd be proud of what came out of all this," I said aloud. "Mike tried to steal the future you wanted to give me, but he accidentally helped me find a future I never knew I wanted. I'm not the same person who trusted him to handle the inheritance paperwork, and I'm not the same person who felt broken when I discovered what he'd done. I'm someone who uses her experience to protect other people's families." A year earlier, I'd received a notification that Mike had completed his parole successfully and was no longer under supervised release. He was working full-time at the warehouse, living in a small apartment, and making regular restitution payments that would take approximately 60 years to complete at his current income level. The notification mentioned that Mike had requested permission to send me updated contact information in case I ever wanted to communicate with him, but I'd declined to receive it. Not out of ongoing anger, but because rebuilding a relationship with someone who'd betrayed me would require emotional energy I preferred to invest in helping other families avoid similar betrayals. "The hardest lesson I learned," I continued, "was that loving someone doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior from them. You taught me that actually, in those letters you left. You loved Mike enough to document his stealing, so I'd have evidence to protect myself. That was real love, the kind that prioritizes someone's well-being over someone's comfort." The decision to accept the federal position felt like the next step in a journey that had started the morning I'd seen strangers loading Dad's handmade jewelry box into a moving truck. Mike's betrayal had been intended to steal my future, but it had ultimately led me to a future more meaningful than anything I'd imagined for myself. Standing up to brush grass off my jeans, I made one final promise to Dad's memory. "I'm going to make sure that what happened to our family helps prevent it from happening to other families. Mike thought he was stealing your legacy, but he actually helped me discover what your real legacy was supposed to be, teaching people to stand up for themselves and protect the people they love." 3 months later, I was living in a furnished apartment in Arlington, Virginia, leading a team of 12 investigators and advocates who were developing the most comprehensive family financial fraud prevention program in American history. The work was challenging and exhausting, and deeply satisfying in ways I'd never experienced. But the most rewarding part wasn't the policy development, or the budget management, or the congressional briefings. It was the letters I received from people who'd protected themselves from family financial betrayal because they'd attended presentations I'd given or read materials I'd helped develop. People like Thomas Chen, who'd realized his nephew was trying to manipulate him into changing his will and had consulted an attorney before signing anything. Maria Rodriguez, who'd discovered her son was using her credit cards without permission and had reported the fraud immediately instead of trying to handle it privately. Patricia Williams, who'd noticed her daughter gradually gaining access to her bank accounts and had implemented safeguards before any money could be stolen. Each success story felt like justice for Dad's memory and proof that Mike's betrayal hadn't been meaningless. The pain he'd caused had been transformed into protection for other families, ensuring that his crime had ultimately prevented more crimes than it had committed. Mike's attempt to steal my inheritance had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He'd taken Dad's money, but he'd accidentally helped me discover Dad's true legacy, the strength to turn trauma into service and to use personal pain to prevent other people's suffering. That was an inheritance that could never be forged, stolen, or gambled away, and it was worth far more than any amount of money Mike could ever have taken from me. 5 years after taking the federal position, I stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University, delivering the keynote address at the National Conference on Financial Crimes Prevention. The audience included FBI agents, state attorneys general, victim advocates, and family law attorneys from every state in the country. Behind me, a massive screen displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible when I first started this work. Family financial fraud reporting had increased by 340% nationally, conviction rates had improved by 180%, and victim recovery amounts had tripled due to faster reporting and better investigation techniques. The woman speaking into that microphone bore little resemblance to the Jessica Martinez who had once stood frozen on Maple Street, watching strangers load her childhood memory into a moving truck. That Jessica had been someone things happened to, someone who waited for other people to handle complex situations, someone who trusted without question because questioning felt like betrayal. This Jessica was someone who made things happen, who simplified complex situations for other people, who understood that healthy relationships were built on transparency rather than blind trust. When my brother forged my signature and sold our family home without my knowledge, I told the audience he thought he was stealing my financial future. What he actually did was reveal my true calling. Every family we've helped protect, every fraud we've prevented, every victim we've empowered to seek justice, represents the transformation of one person's crime into community protection. In the 5 years since establishing the federal task force, our programs had expanded beyond anything I'd initially envisioned. We'd created standardized training curricula for financial institutions, developed early warning systems that flagged suspicious account activities, and established victim advocacy programs in all 50 states. Most importantly, we'd changed the national conversation about family financial fraud from a private shame that families should handle internally to a serious crime that deserved professional intervention and legal consequences. The personal impact stories were what kept me motivated during 14-hour workdays and endless congressional budget hearings. Stories like Margaret Thompson, an 83-year-old widow whose nephew had been systematically transferring money from her accounts by claiming he was helping her pay bills online. Margaret's bank teller had attended one of our training sessions and recognized the pattern of frequent small transfers that gradually escalated to larger amounts. When the teller asked gentle questions about Margaret's online banking activities, Margaret broke down and admitted she'd never authorized any electronic transactions, but had been too embarrassed to admit she didn't understand how her nephew was helping her manage her finances. The investigation revealed that Margaret's nephew had stolen over $150,000 over 18 months, but because the bank had been trained to recognize family financial fraud patterns, they documented the suspicious activities thoroughly. The nephew was prosecuted successfully, and Margaret recovered most of her money through the bank's insurance policies and the nephew's wage garnishment agreement. Margaret called me last month to tell me she's volunteering with a senior advocacy program in her community. I shared with the Georgetown audience. She said that learning to protect herself had given her the confidence to help other elderly people recognize when their trust is being exploited. That's the ultimate goal of everything we do, turning victims into advocates who multiply our impact exponentially. After my presentation, a young woman approached me during the networking reception. She introduced herself as Dr. Amanda Chen, a researcher studying the psychological impact of financial betrayal on family relationships. Her dissertation research had focused specifically on siblings who committed financial crimes against each other, and she'd been following my work since my early presentations in California. "I'm curious about something personal, if you don't mind me asking," Dr. Chen said. "Do you ever wonder what happened to your brother, whether he's learned from his experience or continued the same patterns of behavior?" It was a question I'd been asked dozens of times over the years, and my answer had evolved as I'd processed my own healing journey. "I used to check on his status occasionally," I admitted. "For the first few years, I think I was still hoping he'd have some kind of transformation that would justify the pain he'd caused. But I realized that monitoring his choices was keeping me emotionally invested in his life in ways that weren't healthy for my own recovery." "When did you stop checking?" "When I understood that my healing wasn't dependent on his acknowledgement of wrongdoing or his successful rehabilitation. My brother's choices will always be his responsibility, and my recovery will always be mine. The two things are completely separate, even though they originated from the same incident." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually consistent with what we're seeing in our research. Victims of family financial fraud who achieve the healthiest long-term outcomes are those who find ways to create meaning from their experience without remaining psychologically connected to their perpetrator's ongoing life choices." Her research had identified what she called transformational recovery, the process by which victims of family financial betrayal converted their personal trauma into broader social purpose. Victims who channeled their experience into advocacy, education, or prevention work showed significantly better psychological outcomes than those who focused solely on personal healing or pursuing ongoing justice against their perpetrators. "Your work is actually a textbook example of transformational recovery," Dr. Chen explained. "You've taken the expertise forced on you by victimization and used it to prevent other people from experiencing similar harm. That transformation process appears to be one of the most effective treatments for the specific type of trust trauma that family financial fraud creates." The conversation with Dr. Chen reminded me of something I'd been considering for months. The federal task force had achieved most of its initial goals and was running efficiently under the leadership of the excellent team we'd assembled. I was approaching a natural transition point in my career, and I'd been wondering whether it might be time to tackle the next level of this work. 3 weeks later, I submitted a proposal to the Department of Justice for a new initiative that would expand our family financial fraud prevention work internationally. Many countries were grappling with similar issues as their populations aged and financial systems became more complex, but most lacked comprehensive prevention programs or victim support services. The techniques we've developed in the United States could be adapted for different legal systems and cultural contexts. I wrote in my proposal, "Family financial fraud is a universal problem that transcends national boundaries, and international collaboration could exponentially multiply our impact while allowing us to learn from prevention strategies being developed in other countries." The proposal was ambitious enough to require approval from multiple federal agencies and congressional oversight committees, but the response was immediately positive. Within 6 months, I was invited to present our American model to representatives from 15 countries at a United Nations conference on economic crimes against vulnerable populations. Standing in that UN conference room, addressing delegates from countries I'd never visited, speaking about work that had grown from my own experience of betrayal and recovery, I thought about the letter Dad had left in his lockbox. He'd written about hoping I would stand up for myself the way he'd taught me to stand up for what was right. I don't think he could have imagined that standing up for myself would eventually involve standing up for families around the world. The international program launch coincided with a personal milestone I'd been anticipating with mixed emotions. It had been exactly 10 years since Mike had been sentenced for stealing my inheritance, which meant his restitution obligation had been reduced to a manageable monthly payment that would continue for another 50 years, unless his financial situation improved dramatically. I'd received periodic updates through the victim notification system, but I'd stopped reading them after the first few years. The most recent update, which I glanced at briefly before filing it away, indicated that Mike was still working at the same warehouse, still living in modest circumstances, still making his required payments. He'd apparently completed a bachelor's degree through a prison correspondence program and had been promoted to a supervisory position that came with a small salary increase. The notification also mentioned that Mike had gotten married the previous year to someone he'd met through a financial responsibility support group. His new wife was apparently aware of his criminal history and the ongoing restitution obligation, and they'd chosen to live within strict financial boundaries that ensured his payments to me would continue uninterrupted. Reading about Mike's marriage sparked a moment of unexpected reflection. For years, I'd assumed that his betrayal had damaged his capacity for healthy relationships as much as it had initially damaged mine, but apparently he'd found someone who could love him despite his history of financial crimes, someone willing to build a life constrained by the consequences of choices he'd made before they met. There was something oddly hopeful about that information, not because I had any desire to reconcile with Mike or include him in my life, but because it suggested that people could change and grow, even after committing serious crimes. Mike's marriage didn't erase the harm he'd caused or eliminate his ongoing obligations to me, but it indicated that he'd found ways to build meaningful relationships within the limitations created by his own choices. That evening, I called Linda Chen, who had remained a friend, an occasional consultant throughout my career in victim advocacy. She was retired now, spending her time traveling and volunteering with legal aid organizations, but she still followed my work with interest. I got the update about Mike's marriage, I told her. It's strange how indifferent I feel about it. 10 years ago, any news about his life would have triggered emotional reactions. Now it's just information. That's exactly what healthy recovery looks like, Linda said. You've reached a point where his choices don't affect your emotional equilibrium. Whether he succeeds or struggles, whether he's learned from his mistakes or continued making them, none of that impacts your sense of well-being or security. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty about not caring more. He is still my brother, technically. Jessica, you gave Mike every opportunity to maintain a relationship with you by treating you with honesty and respect. He chose to forfeit that relationship when he decided to commit crimes against you. The fact that you've recovered enough to feel indifferent about his life is a sign of strength, not callousness. Linda was right, but her words also highlighted something I'd been thinking about more frequently as my career expanded internationally. My experience with Mike had taught me valuable lessons about family relationships, trust, and recovery that extended far beyond financial fraud prevention. The most important lesson was that love and accountability weren't contradictory concepts. You could love someone and still hold them responsible for harm they'd caused. You could forgive someone for your own emotional health while still expecting them to face appropriate consequences for their choices. You could wish someone well from a distance while maintaining boundaries that protected you from further harm. These weren't just principles for dealing with family financial fraud, they were principles for building healthy relationships of all kinds. Some of the most meaningful work I'd done over the years involved helping victims understand that seeking justice wasn't incompatible with processing grief, anger, and even love for the family members who'd betrayed them. A month after the UN conference, I received an email that surprised me more than any news about Mike ever could. The message was from Tom Bennett, the man who'd purchased Dad's house and discovered the lockbox that had provided crucial evidence for Mike's prosecution. Dear Jessica, Tom's email began. I hope this message finds you well. I've been following your career in victim advocacy through online articles and news reports, and I wanted to reach out with some information you might find meaningful. Tom explained that he'd been renovating the basement of the house over the past few years and had discovered something else hidden behind the water heater, a space Dad had apparently used as a workshop for small carpentry projects. Inside the space, Tom had found a partially completed jewelry box that appeared to match the one I'd seen being loaded into the moving truck 10 years earlier. Based on the tools and materials I found, it looks like your father was making this as a gift for someone, Tom wrote. There's a piece of paper with for Jessica's 25th birthday, written in the same handwriting as the letters you showed me years ago. I thought you should have it, regardless of who technically owns the house now. Tom's email included photos of the unfinished jewelry box, and seeing it brought back a flood of memories I'd thought were lost forever. Dad had made me a jewelry box for my 16th birthday, and apparently he'd been working on a second one before his death. The craftsmanship was unmistakably his, the same careful attention to detail, the same creative flourishes I remembered from the furniture he'd built throughout my childhood. I'd be honored to complete the project using your father's original design, Tom continued. I've been learning woodworking as a hobby, and I think I could finish it the way he intended. Would you be interested in having it? 2 weeks later, Tom drove to Sacramento to deliver the completed jewelry box. He'd done beautiful work, matching Dad's style so perfectly that I couldn't tell where Dad's craftsmanship ended and Tom's began. Inside the box, Tom had placed a note explaining his restoration process and expressing his hope that the gift would provide some connection to positive memories of my father. Opening that jewelry box felt like receiving a message from Dad that had been delayed by 10 years of legal battles, career changes, and personal growth. The mirror inside reflected a face that had been shaped by experiences Dad never lived to see, challenges he couldn't have imagined when he was carefully sanding wood in his basement workshop. But the woman looking back from that mirror was someone Dad would have recognized. Someone who stood up for herself and others. Someone who turned obstacles into opportunities. Someone who protected people who needed protecting. Someone who understood that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but character and purpose. That evening, I placed the jewelry box on my dresser in my Arlington apartment, next to the framed photo of Dad I'd carried with me through every move and job change of the past decade. Looking at both objects together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with Mike's restitution payments or legal consequences. Dad had left me everything I needed to build a meaningful life, not the house that Mike had stolen, not the money that had been gambled away, but the values and strength that had enabled me to transform personal trauma into community service. Mike had thought he was stealing my inheritance, but he'd only stolen the material symbols of it. The actual inheritance, the capacity to turn adversity into advocacy, pain into purpose, had been part of my character all along. The following month marked the 10th anniversary of the day I'd first seen that moving truck outside Dad's house. Instead of commemorating the date as a reminder of betrayal and loss, I spent it speaking to a group of federal law enforcement officers about the importance of treating family financial fraud with the same seriousness as stranger-perpetrated crimes. 10 years ago, I thought my inheritance had been stolen, I told the officers. Today I understand that my real inheritance was never something that could be stolen, it was the ability to recognize injustice, the courage to seek accountability, and the wisdom to transform personal experience into protection for others. That inheritance has now been passed on to thousands of families who are safer because they understand how to recognize financial manipulation and protect themselves from it. My brother thought he was taking my future away from me. Instead, he accidentally helped me discover what my future was supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.